Dr. David Caplan. He's in Boston right now. He's a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School, and he's also an associate neurologist at the Mass General Hospital and Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital in Boston. And once he's done, he's going to talk about the role of working memory in language comprehension. Do you want to use the podium mic? Do you want the monitoring mic?
I think I'll hold that. Can people hear me here? Okay. I might take this, we'll see. And then it's going to squeak, right?
No, well, I don't know.
If they're too close, then they'll squeak.
Don't say that.
Can I? Fine. Well, firstly, I want to thank Nadine for inviting me to talk here. It's a great pleasure. I was here at Temple University for a 9-month period in 1981-82, where I had worked with Ellie and Myrna. They didn't stay here very long, but they became lifelong friends, and it's just a big part of my memories from the early part of my own career and the early part of cognitive neuropsychology. I'm going to talk about the role of working memory in language comprehension, which, as Nadine mentioned, was a topic that Ellie was very interested in. I guess this is the medical side of me, no disclosures. This is the outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the concept and measurement of working memory. There will be some overlap with what Marie just said. I'm going to briefly outline the necessity for memory in some aspects of language comprehension. Then I'm going to turn to studies of the relationship between working memory and language comprehension under 3 headings: individual differences studies, interference studies, and neuropsychology studies, which include both individual differences and interference studies. And then I'm going to come to some conclusions which you might consider to be more speculations than conclusions. Marie, I think, presented an overview of the concept of working memory, looking at it very broadly. I'm going to start the other way around. Working memory emerged from previous concepts of short-term memory and short-term store. What were the reasons for thinking there were such things as what happened here? As short-term memory and short-term store. These are phenomena in very simple experiments like list recall experiments, which include things like limited immediate serial recall, that is limited span, recency effects in free recall, rapid forgetting of very short sequences of letters or numbers with interference, the Brown-Peterson effect. And various accounts of these phenomena led to the postulation of a memory system that had very limited capacity, that involved phonological encoding of verbal information. I'm only going to be talking about verbal short-term memory and working memory here. That was subject to rapid decay and, of course, to interference, and that was refreshed by subvocal rehearsal. A major problem with this entire concept was that this system never seemed to find any functions, and in a very famous critique, Crowder in 1982 stressed this in his arguments, which were mostly technical arguments, against the very existence of this system. And the notion of working memory sought to connect this notion of short-term memory to function. One way of capturing that was expressed by Nelson Cowan in a paper where he said working memory includes short-term memory and other processing mechanisms that help to make use of short-term memory. I'm going to just characterize that relationship in 3 different ways. One was the way that Badley and Hinch first described it in 1974 in the first paper that used the term as working memory being a system that maintains limited item and order information for short periods of time in the service of a task. Not terribly well defined, but you get the idea. A second version of this, I attributed here to David Carpenter. It's probably a little clearer in Justin Carpenter's Psych Review 1992 paper. Is that working memory performs operations, that is, computations, on the contents of information in short-term memory. And a third version of this, which is due to Kane and Engel and many others in that group, is that working memory includes the mechanisms that control the entry, the level of activation, and removal of information from short-term memory. That's sort of the conception that Marie mostly talked about. And I sort of decided to draw a little diagram of this, showing that the core notion of short-term memory, historically anyway, was the maintenance of item and order information, to which computations could be added and eventually attentional control. Now, Baddeley's notion of short-term memory surely included those two outer rings, but 95% of his work was actually about the inner ring. He never really changed his spots, as far as I can see. He remained a short-term memory theorist. And he introduced a whole bunch of new paradigms, or emphasized them, and phenomena into the discussion of the nature of the short-term memory system. We're going to dwell on Baddeley's model for a few minutes here because I think it's familiar to many of you, especially in neuropsychology, at least experimental neuropsychology. And I think a lot of people, at least I, kind of believed it was the only model and there were no other alternatives until Nadine asked me to write a review paper on this, in which I discovered that it had a lot of competition. And so I'm just going to recapitulate my own intellectual history of the last 4 or 5 years in the next 2 slides. I grew up believing that the critical phenomena in the study of these memory mechanisms were phonological similarity effects, immediacy or recall, word length effects, the effects of unattended speech, the effects of concurrent articulation, and to a lesser extent some other manipulations like alternating features in lists. And this led to Baddeley's working memory model, but I want to emphasize it's a model, it's the working memory model of short-term memory. And this is the famous diagram. I've never really understood exactly how the episodic buffer fits into this. Nelson made it pretty easy for me when he just said, well, it just replaced the central executive. Anyway, I just want, for the record, to raise a number of issues about this model. Just not to leave you with the idea that there's nothing solid here, but to leave you with the idea that there's a lot that's unknown. The first issue is that there are any number of very respectable people who think this whole thing is nonsense, that there's no such thing as short-term memory, that the mechanisms that retrieve information from long-term memory apply at short intervals, and there's no separate store, that short-term memory is a reification of experimental phenomena. A lot of people believe that this model of Baddeley's is incomplete and that there are other important components that maintain item and order information, most notably a well-known neuropsychologist who shares a last name with the conference organizer. The opposite is also maintained, that some components, if not the whole working memory system or short-term memory system doesn't exist, at least some components don't exist, especially the phonological store. That really lives a very questionable life. There's a huge debate in the literature about whether decay actually happens in short-term memory. There's a debate about the role of articulatory rehearsal, with people like Nelson Cowan arguing that it plays no role or minimal role in maintaining information, and that affects the structure of the working memory model that Baddeley proposed. What maintains order information is really unclear. Baddeley maintained it was rehearsal. People like Page believe that there are primacy gradients that determine it. Temporal features have been postulated and modeled computationally. Chaining, I must say, seems to be out on a number of grounds, but positional codes are widely accepted, and again, there's some interesting neuropsychology results from the Hopkins group that support that, but this is very much unclear. And as far as I can tell, in all the studies where the papers have the word short-term memory in the title, there's nothing about the retrieval mechanisms, but there's a lot about retrieval mechanisms in papers by Dosher and McElree, and those are very relevant to sentence comprehension. Okay. I felt like I had to mention that for an audience that might have what might be an inappropriate degree of faith in the Baddeley model. It may not have been necessary for you, it was for me. In the area of comprehension, there is a broad consensus that this central executive is the component of the working memory model that supports comprehension. Justin Carpenter were explicit about that. And the features of the central executive are that it is of short duration, it holds multimodal and abstract representations, maintains them. Justin Carpenter today, we believe that it performs computations as well as has a storage function. Everybody believes that its capacity for storage, and if you think computation is part of its function, then for both computation and storage is limited. However, I don't know of a single computational model that actually includes a specification of both the storage and the computational components of a central executive. It's a very poorly defined concept. What has been much better defined and much better studied is a central store without the computational component that maintains abstract representations for short periods of time. But there's a lot of controversy about the nature of that store. So Nelson Cowan, who I keep mentioning, I think this is the last time his name comes up, thinks that it's limited to 4 items with a fixed limit. Paul Verhagen, on the basis of a number of very interesting experiments, thinks that its capacity is variable. And McElroy thinks it doesn't exist, that all there is a focus of attention, which you see in this diagram from his website on the right. Okay, turning to the measurement of working memory. As Marie said, it's measured with complex span tasks of various sorts, Daneman and Carpenter being the first. Performance on these tasks does correlate well, on average 0.57 in the Daneman and Miracle 1997 paper, with performance on other high-level cognitive tasks, and it correlates well with measures of fluid intelligence, in particular the Ravens. And there are lots of other working memory tasks that Marie described, all of which have similar kind of characteristics. But I want to point out a couple of limitations of these tasks. One is that none of them measure the central store, which is the only well-defined component of the central executive. None of them measure executive attention in the Kane and Engel sense. The tests are geared towards measuring working memory, conceived of as a system that stores and manipulates information, which, as I said, is the least well-defined notion in the system. And they also require a lot of other cognitive functions, such as, for instance, dividing attention. They're affected by other cognitive functioning. A great deal of the variance and almost all of the age-related changes in variance in working memory tasks is explained by variance in speed of processing measures. There are miserable psychometric properties of most of these tests individually. Test-retest correlations are borderline. This is a study that my wife and colleague Gloria Waters and I published 2003, where test-retest reliability is considered reasonable, should be about 0.7. Almost none of these measures made it. Correlations of performance across different working memory tests are also, in most cases, very low. And in my opinion, I just come off 3 weeks of attending on the consultation service. Working memory tests should carry an APA black box warning, something like this. They are subject to significant measurement error and can measure undefined concepts. Significant risk for reaching invalid conclusions can occur with their use. Is there a solution? The obvious solution would be use several tests and possibly factor scores over several tests. To my knowledge, it's rarely done. I had on this slide saying, to my knowledge, our group is the only group that's done that, but that's not quite true. But it's very rarely done. Okay, so much for the first part of the talk on working memory. Shifting gears for a minute before I try to bring these two lines of concepts together. What do we need memory for in comprehension? Well, I'm going to focus on sentences and discourse, where there are lots of memory requirements. So all of these little blue lines are lines between words in this sentence, the boy who ate the steak liked it, that contain a relationship between the words. So boy has to be, I don't know if I can do this very well here, I'm afraid. This is a little tricky here. Boy has to be related to the, boy has to be related to who, boy has to be related to liked, it has to be related to liked, it has to be related to steak, you get the idea. And if you add another sentence, his friends did too, you get other relationships in which you have to relate items in the later sentence to items in the early sentence. These are the kinds of things that require some sort of memory. Why might this be of interest? It's of interest because the ability to understand sentences and discourse occurs in the right time frame for the working memory system, the way I've presented it, to possibly support its memory needs. It has a heavy memory and computational component. The ability to understand sentences and discourse are highly practiced domain-specific skills. So this is a test case of the possibility that the working memory system, as measured, possibly as conceived of, plays a role in a very important automatized human skill, as opposed to functions that are much more under controlled and conscious control. Okay, what are the possible connections then between working memory systems and the memory system that supports sentence and discourse comprehension? Well, one possibility is that information might be retained in phonological form. As I said, most people haven't been too interested in that, but there are some papers that suggest that is not a crazy idea. Rehearsal might be needed to retain information in comprehension. A major area of research in the last 15 years has been the possibility that retrieval of information that previously presented in sentences or discourse might use the same retrieval mechanisms that are used in working memory. That work comes from Julie Van Dyke and Brian McElry and Foraker and a number of other people, and it's been very influential in experimental psycholinguistics. But I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk about what's been the dominant relationship, or thought to be the dominant relationship over the past 20 years, which is that the capacity limits of working memory, the CS, I suppose, determine limits of comprehension. This has been thought to be true globally for humans as a species, going back to Miller and Chomsky, 1954, and more recently taken up by Rick Lewis in a number of papers. The part that I'm going to talk about is that capacity limitations in working memory might set limits of the ability of individuals to understand sentences that make significant memory demand, sentences and discourse. What's the way that we can look at this? Well, there are basically two ways that have been used. One is through individual differences studies. You try to correlate the measure of working memory with a measure of the online assignment of syntactic structure and its interpretation, or discourse structure and its interpretation. The logic is that if working memory supports sentence and discourse comprehension, people with lower working memory should show abnormal or inefficient comprehension. And then there's a second line that has to do with line of research that has to do with interference, and I'll turn to that in a minute. So I'm going to present a number of studies in each of these domains. They're all from my lab. That's because I'm most familiar with them. There are other studies in the literature, and if anybody wants to ask me about them, I'll be glad to talk about them to the extent that I can retrieve them from long-term memory. Okay, the approach here is to create stimuli that allow contrasts of online behavior at points at which memory load varies, and then to correlate these online behaviors with working memory. So here are some of the favorite sentences that are used in this kind of a study. Object extracted relatives like the mouse that the dog bit ran away, where at bit you have to retrieve both dog and mouse and possibly their order. And a sentence that means the same thing but has a different syntactic structure. The dog that bit the mouse ran away, where at bit you only have to retrieve one piece of information, and at mouse you have to connect up that word to one other item. And typically what we look at is some kind of measure of behavior at bit in these two sentences. Ancillary analyses look at behaviors at bit in the first sentence and mouse in the second sentence, which are both at the end of their clauses. Gloria and I have done any number of studies. You're going to see data having to do with these kinds of sentences several times, in which we contrasted sentences of these sorts with this contrast embedded in different contexts. So cleft subjects and cleft objects, it was the movie that terrified the child versus it was the child that the movie terrified. Subject, relatives, the cabin that warmed the scout versus the cabin that the scout warmed. Object, subject sentences, the scout warmed the cabin that contained the firewood, the cabin that the scout warmed contained the firewood. And I'm going to show you a variety of graphs like this of self-paced listening times at the segments in these sentences aligned so that the verbs in the object and subject extracted sentences are aligned. So those of you who are familiar with these stimuli will realize that the order of the words in the sentences doesn't correspond to the order of the words on the x-axis. And these are the results of self-paced listening times in somewhere around 100 college students for the object extracted relatives in blue and the subject extracted relatives in red. And the three lines represent high span, middle span, and low span subjects. And as you can see, there's a dramatic effect of sentence structure at the point at which you would expect it, and no effect of working memory and no interaction. Similarly for the second of those contrasts, similarly for the third of those contrasts. The correlations between working memory and language processing measures online was insignificant for almost all of the measures. There were some correlations between working memory measures and end-of-sentence processing. Gail Deedy, who's sitting over there, worked on a paper, was first author on a paper in Psych and Aging in 2004, I think it was, in which we looked at a much larger pool of subjects in whom we measured working memory and online syntactic processing and a global language comprehension measure using the Nelson-Denny. And we, as you'll see as we go through these studies, you're going to see different kinds of analytic techniques that sort of developed over the years. This is a structural equation model of the working memory effect on the Nelson-Denny. The beta weight here is 0.49, and it's highly significant. When you look at the effects of working memory on the language processing measured as the online self-paced reading measure, the beta weight is 0.04 and obviously 0.04 and obviously not significant. Will Evans, who's a current graduate student, has looked at Gail, this is still work that Gail did. In a second study in which we looked at 200 individuals aged 20 to 90, we looked at 5 different sentence contrasts. I hope I won't paralyze all of you by showing you these data, but I am going to show you the data, so take a deep breath. The first of these is contrast of subject and object extracted relatives. I'm sure that you can't see these numbers, maybe even from the first row, and certainly not from the back row. But these are multi-level models of the effects of structure, working memory, age, and speed of processing on self-paced listening times at the verbs of these object-extracted sentences. And you'll have to take my word for it that there's no effect of working memory and no interaction with condition. I'm going to read you these sentences. These sentences are difficult, but within human capacity to understand. We thought we would push the envelope by presenting sentences that are very difficult for people to understand without revision. And so the second set of sentences that we presented in this study were sentences that have been studied by Grodner and Gibson. The difficult sentence is the following. It's the second one here for those of you who have eagle vision. The dealer who the jewelry that was identified by the victim implicated was arrested by the police. Okay, tough. The baseline sentence is a sentential complement, which is not easy, but much easier. The dealer indicated that the jewelry that was identified by the victim implicated one of his friends. So implicated in those two sentences impose very, very different memory loads, and there's no effect of age, working memory, speed of processing on the added time spent in self-paced reading of implicated in this second sentence compared to the first sentence. Those sentences don't necessarily require, those sentences are difficult, but they can be, but they don't necessarily require a revision of anything that you have previously assigned. It's just difficult to assign the structure in the first place. Another possibility that people have suggested is that working memory might be required when the discourse or the sentence requires you to revise a structure that you had already assigned. So we looked at 3 cases like this, and this is the work that Will Evans, our current graduate student, has been doing. I'm going to skip this slide. It's interesting, but a side story. We looked at 3 cases of revision. One is a very simple revision, a pragmatic revision of pronouns. So we gave people passages like, Meg wanted Kate to look over some important papers. Meg had to mail Kate the documents by Monday. Unfortunately, she never sent the documents, which is the continuation version where the subject of sent is Meg, as opposed to, unfortunately, she never received the documents, which is the revision condition. There are many psycholinguistic reasons why one initially takes the subject of a sentence like this to be Meg and not Kate. What we found were effects of revision, that's the red bar, and effects of working memory, but no interaction. It's not any harder for the low working memory people to do this revision than the low working memory people. A fairly well-known condition in experimental psycholinguistics in which revision is necessary. It's thought to be necessary on many theoretical models of the phenomena is the so-called repeated name effect. If you repeat a name, that's pragmatically infelicitous, and the explanation, the one account, the dominant account indicates that you first insert another entity into the discourse with the same name, and then you go back and you revise that insertion to co-index the repeated name with the previously mentioned name. So the examples are things like Sue gave Liz a pet hamster. Sue told her that hamsters eat vegetable scraps and live about 4 years. Sue is harder to read than she told Liz that hamsters eat vegetable scraps and live about 4 years. Again, you can see that there are effects, very small effects of the repeated name. I guess you might not be able to see them here, but the blue bar is the condition in which there are repeated names in both subject and object position. That is statistically longer than any of the other bars. And effects of working memory. Low working memory subjects are slower overall. Again, no interaction. And then the last example that I'm going to run through briefly is a purely syntactic revision. These are also well-known sentences in experimental psycholinguistics called early closure, late closure sentences. I'll start with the late closure sentence. That's the easy one. After the hunter shot the deer, it ran away. Where the closure of the subordinate clause after the hunter shot is late. It occurs after the deer. After the hunter shot the deer is all one clause, as opposed to an early closure sentence, after the hunter shot the deer ran away. That's difficult because we have a tendency to take deer as the object of shot, and then that analysis has to be revised, and shot has to be interpreted as an intransitive. Again, there are effects of early closure versus late closure, effects of working memory, no interactions. So these are a sampling of studies in the literature and from our lab that I think are typical and that I think demonstrate that there is no evidence from these and I think many other studies for a role of working memory as measured standardly in either online parsing and interpretation or the reanalysis of sentences and discourse to which one has assigned a structure. I'm going to run through interference studies in normals. I think I'm doing fine on time. Okay, good. All right. The logic here is very similar to the logic in interference studies. If working memory supports sentence and discourse comprehension, imposing a concurrent working memory load should lead to abnormal or less efficient comprehension. So going back to those sentences that I showed you originally with those graphs that I hope are stored away in your visual working memory, you can see that these are the self-paced reading times for those verbs in the object versus subject extracted sentences under no load conditions on the left, under a 3-digit load condition on the right, under a 5-digit load condition, in the middle on the 5-digit load condition on the right. Again, you can see effects of sentence structure, minimal effects of load, no interactions. This is for the second set of sentences. This is for the third set of sentences. I want to pause for a minute to talk about a study that I don't know how many of you will have heard about, but in the psycholinguistic literature, it has received a lot of press. And that's a study by Ev Fedorenko, who did something a little bit different, where she imposed, where she had people do concurrent tasks. So she had people self-pace their way through these kinds of sentences, subject and object extracted sentences, at the same time as they did arithmetical tasks. So the object extracted sentences are hard and the subject extracted sentences are easy. And there are two versions of the arithmetic tasks, an easy one which starts with the digits 1 through 10, and then you had to add digits between 1 and 3, and a hard one where the first digit was somewhere between 10 and 20, and you had to add digits that were between 4 and 6. So there's a lot more carrying in the second. And this is how the paradigm looks. You see a screen with 12 and the janitor, then you see a screen with +4 and who frustrated the plumber, then +5 and lost the key, and +4 on the street. And at the end, you have to say, you had to answer a question, I think 2 questions about the sentence, and you had to say what the sum of all those numbers were. And what she found was a superadditive interaction in the self-paced time for that combined task in the hard condition, which she interpreted as an indication that the operations that were responsible for assigning the structure of that sentence and the operations that were responsible for doing arithmetic shared some form of resource. There are any number of issues about this. This is obviously an extremely complicated task, and it's very unclear that this has anything to do with online sentence processing. But this paper got a lot of play in the psycholinguistic literature. She also did a nice control in which she had visual secondary tasks, and you had to say how much of a total circle these filled quadrants would have occupied, and there she didn't find a superadditive interaction. This was a convincing paper for a lot of people in the literature, and so we decided we would try to replicate it and added an eye fixation component. We utterly failed to replicate this, including using Ev's stimuli. So that is, it's hard to know exactly how to interpret that anyway, given the nature of the task, but that is one interference study that I would not consider to be anywhere near as strong evidence for a shared resource for language processing and arithmetic or other cognitive functions as a lot of people seem to believe. Okay, turning to neuropsychology, which was of course Ellie's area. I'm going to start with individual differences studies. We have done a number of studies with various populations. We're going to start with severe reductions in working memory. These are patients with Alzheimer's disease, matched for age and education with a set of controls, but significantly reduced working memory spans. Here are those self-paced reading. This is now self-paced listening, not self-paced reading. for the sentences that you saw before, you can see that the Alzheimer's patients are taking a lot longer, but they're showing the same sentence type effects. There's no interaction in any of those three sentence types. I'm going to just go over another way of looking at this. These are patients with aphasia. There's a paper that just came out last year in cognitive neuropsychology, in which we looked at 61 patients with aphasia and 46 age and education matched controls. We measured working memory using 6 tests that just required simple forwards recall of items, and 4 tests that required some kind of manipulation, so simple span versus complex span. We measured sentence comprehension in 3 separate tasks: object manipulation, self-paced sentence picture matching, and sentence picture matching using auditory moving windows. On 11 sentence types and 20 examples of each, these sentence types fall into 4 groups: object, relatives, passives, sentences, reflexives, and sentences with pronouns. To make a very long story short, there were effects of span on accuracy and reaction time in the tasks where you could measure reaction time to respond to the sentence picture matching. No effect whatsoever on self-paced listening times. The interaction of these short-term memory measures and sentence type speaks to the role of short-term memory and syntactically based comprehension. There were 4 types of interactions in accuracy, all of which made sense, but none in self-paced listening times. I think I'm going to skip this, but we did examine, because you won't see the numbers, we did examine individual patients who had, I'm going to go over it quickly, who had working memory spans that were below the range that would be expected in the controls. And I'm showing you here a series of patients with abnormally low working memory spans. The top matrix is abnormally low forward spans. The bottom is abnormally low complex so-called working memory spans. And these are patients who have at least one measurement in either the online measure in the self-paced listening study or in the accuracy measurement for one of these 4 sentence types that is in the normal range. The colored people have only normal performances in both self-paced listening and in accuracy for all 4 types of syntactic structures that we measured. Interference studies. I don't know of any interference studies in pathological populations that measure online processing, but one of the studies that we worked the hardest on was an interference study with end-of-sentence measures in aphasic patients, where we had aphasic patients concurrently recall 10 digits, sequences of digits up to their span or one below their span, while they matched 9 types of sentences to pictures. As you can see, there's a sentence type effect. There is absolutely no difference in the performance of these patients under a concurrent digit load that is equal to their span or one less than their span. This was a hard study to do because we had to find people who were not at ceiling or at floor in any of these sentence types, so there would be room for a secondary task to actually be manifest. Okay, so the conclusions based upon these neuropsychology studies are, I think, congruent with the conclusions based upon the normative studies. Working memory plays an optional and facilitative role in supporting the use of the products of comprehension to perform tasks. Disorders of working memory comprehension do not, I'm going to say, necessarily produce online syntactically based comprehension deficits. Let me turn to some broader issues. I think I have 5 minutes. These are a lot more vague and speculative, but I think they're more germane to the topic of the conference than these kind of minutiae about sentence processing and discourse processing. If the 3 things I want to say a few words about are: if working memory doesn't support sentence and discourse memory, what does? What does this imply about working memory and its as a measure of executive attention? And what role does working memory have in comprehension? I've sort of touched on that before. Okay. If working memory doesn't support sentence and discourse memory, what does? Well, we recently suggested that long-term working memory is what supports sentence and discourse comprehension. This could just be hand-waving on account of that long-term working memory isn't really all that well defined or studied. But it does have intuitive appeal as the system that might support sentence comprehension. At least some of its features overlap with the features of memory processes that we see in sentence comprehension. Just for those of you who don't know what it is, long-term working memory is a putative memory system that accounts for the greatly expanded short-term memory that's seen after training with digit spans of more than 40, in some cases 90. Greatly expanded short-term memory in experts, like memory for chess moves, waiters' memories for orders, things like that. Erickson and Kinch have a sort of a position paper about this in Psych Review in 1995, and Erickson's done a lot of work on this. The features of individuals in whom long-term working memory is operative is that they have a lot of domain-specific knowledge, like waiters and chess players. And they have a high degree of familiarity with the task. The features of the behavior that are characteristic of long-term working memory is that it manifests a large capacity for memory of item and order information. It's quite impervious to temporal interruption. Waiters can move away from your table and do a lot of other things, come back and remember who ordered what. It is associated with encoded information, complex encoded information, coded in complex ways that are retrieved by domain-specific, very complex retrieval cues. When people who have digit spans of 40 are asked, how do you do it? They develop all these very idiosyncratic ad hoc ways of remembering what the digits were. Well, these are features that are found in sentence comprehension. The people who understand sentences and discourse like us have a great deal of domain-specific knowledge about what their structures are. We have an enormous familiarity with the task. We can maintain a large capacity for the memory of item and order information. People can remember quite a lot of discourse verbatim, much more than they can remember of unrelated words, although not as much as you can when you're practiced in chess, but it wouldn't be very hard to get people to remember things, many more than 90 words if they were in a coherent discourse. There are very few studies on whether or not sentence comprehension or discourse comprehension is impervious to temporal interruption, but the ones that have been studied are surprisingly interesting, because they do not show a great deal of difficulty after interruption of a task. The only experimental one that I know of in sentence comprehension is Warner Marazzo's 1978, which is a very interesting study. And of course, these domains are associated with a great deal of domain-specific knowledge and retrieval cues that are entirely domain-specific. I think it's worthwhile thinking about long-term working memory more, knowing more about retrieval mechanisms in long-term working memory, and in skilled performances in general, and thinking about language comprehension maybe in that term, in those terms. What about working memory and its relationship to executive attention? Well, to the extent that the working memory tests that we used in these studies measure executive attention, you'd have to conclude that executive attention is not involved in sustaining attention to the comprehension process, because we didn't see effects of working memory on these aspects of the comprehension process. And this raises, I think, a lot of very interesting questions about what executive attention actually does and what it regulates. In a paper that I like a lot about this, Kiefer said, characterized executive attention's role in two ways. That one quote is, executive control factors such as attention, intentions, and task sets orchestrate the unconscious processing streams. And a second is that attentional mechanisms increase or decrease the sensitivity of processing pathways for incoming stimuli. And I'm going to recast those expressions in the following terms. When you perform a task, for motivational regions, you set task goals. And in order to actually perform the task, and those task goals specify a functional architecture of cognitive operations that will actually accomplish the task goals. I think that cognitive architecture requires attention to be activated and to be maintained. And one possibility is that attention is directed at maintaining the functional architecture. So for instance, those of you who are taking notes have to activate a functional architecture for writing, for accessing the written forms of words, and so on. And I would argue that the executive attention system has to maintain that task set. In order for you to do that, it has to maintain that its role, one role, in the notion of orchestrate the unconscious processing streams, is to keep that functional architecture active. Another possibility is that executive attention can penetrate into the cognitive operations that are in these functional architectures. And that's how I'm going to interpret this notion of increase or decrease the sensitivity of processing pathways. I haven't the slightest idea whether this is what Kiefer had in mind. And that would mean that executive attention could not only, set up the comprehension system, whatever it is, in you, but could actually focus your attention on lexical access or on intonational contours or on parsing and activate the level of those components of the functional architectural system. So I'm going to suggest that the studies that I reviewed here indicate that the executive attention system does not, at least ordinarily, penetrate inside the functional architecture for normal comprehension, although it must penetrate the incremental interaction of that functional architecture with any use of the products of the process to perform task-related operations. There's excellent work by Artie Roelofs that shows that it can penetrate the functional architecture for speech production. It's complicated work, and I'm not going to go into it, but if you change the functional architecture to the speech production architecture, Roelofs and others have shown, I think, very convincingly that attentional systems can determine the activation of various aspects of the functional architecture for speech production. Why? Is this an issue of input versus output of language? Is it a matter of the degree to which speech comprehension and discourse comprehension is automatized and therefore dependent on long-term working memory versus controlled, which is much more the case when we speak? Are those things somehow parallel? I'm going to leave those questions open. Last, is there any role for working memory? Well, I've said yes with a little bit of a question mark because not all the studies have shown this. But in general, working memory correlates reasonably well with end-of-sentence measures. I have some data here which you can't see from that study of 200 subjects. I'm going to say that working memory sustains the representation of sentence and discourse meaning in order to perform a task. So the last two things are sort of wrap-up concluding thoughts. Working memory is studied with conscious-controlled unpracticed tasks. To the extent that the analysis of performance and behavior in these tasks has yielded a valid psychological construct, that construct and the measures that led to it might only be relevant to memory that is engaged in these kinds of tasks. It might not be relevant to the memory that's involved in more automatized skills. If this is true, it seems to me to have potential applications for the topic of a lot of this conference, which is the effects of training working memory. If it's true, one would not expect that training working memory would lead to improvement in task-specific skills. However, it could very well lead to improvement in the ability to maintain functional architectures, and where the executive attention system can penetrate into tasks, it might have effects. Also, to the extent that we're dealing with brain-damaged individuals in whom the components of the functional architectures are damaged, those components may not be fully automatized, and working memory training may improve the operation of a component that is no longer so automatized. I think it's of theoretical interest, and I think it's of practical interest. I wasn't going to conclude with this, but I will because it occurred to me. And I've come off 3 weeks of attending. I see a lot of patients in my office who have memory problems. And many of them ask me, should they buy, what's the latest one? Lumosity. Before that, it was neurolinguistic programming. And I tell them, only if you want to be really good at whatever is in Lumosity, that the degree to which those things, the skills that Lumosity trains you on, transfer to other automatized skills, which is what I think they are asking me about. There's not much transfer. That might be too pessimistic. I tell them, practice the skills that you want to acquire. If you want to learn to play the piano, not the violin. And I'll leave it with that. I'm not intending to cast cold water on the working memory training thing, but just to ask some questions about where it might be, where its effectiveness might lie, and to raise some questions about whether it will be effective in all domains. Thank you.
I have a couple of related questions. First is whether, recent results from Mary and McDonald showing that just more exposure to non-canonical sentences makes you better at processing them. And I just wanted you to comment on whether her results and your results are kind of pointing to the same idea. And the second question I had is how I see both of these results as suggesting that processing non-canonical sentences is much more automatized than we might have previously thought, and I just wondered if I'm wrong about that.
I think the Misiak and McDonald results, I think you said, are very consistent with this view. And I think that they are talking about an automatized system for they think implicit learning of artificial grammars. And the relationship between that ability and sentence comprehension. And I think that the modeling that Mort Christensen and Mary Ellen McDonald did earlier is about training people on sentences and then training a simulation on sentences and then seeing how efficient it was at generalization. So I think that it's completely consistent. And I think the second wasn't a question, it was sort of a comment. Do I think that the processing of some of these non-canonical sentences is automatized? Yes. These are difficult sentences, but they're not impossible to understand. So, I mean, it's hard to. That is an interesting and difficult question to know exactly at what point comprehension of a sentence or a discourse is automatized. Well, one litmus here is the proportion of regressive eye movements. There's some increase in regressive eye movements at the verbs of the object-extracted sentences, but it's very, very small. What you see at the verb, well, I mean, there are different studies that have shown different things, but I think the study that has at this point become most definitive is a study by Staub in 2010, who showed that first fixations on verbs of these sentences are prolonged, but later fixations are not. And that suggests that there's more processing being done when the verb of the object-extracted sentence is encountered, but then the eyes move forward because that processing can be done incrementally, the same as all the other processing.
Very nice presentation.
Can you speak right into the microphone?
I noticed you you always talk about sentence comprehension and discourse comprehension together. So in your view, do they always, will they always be subject to the same relationship with working memory and attention, whatever you want to call it?
So I think the question is, am I drawing a distinction between discourse and sentence processing? Well, there are differences, of course. I mean, there's no syntactic structure to a discourse, at least in the narrow sense of syntactic structure that you get in theoretical linguistics. But psychologically, I think that the comprehension process yields a preferred discourse congruent representation of words and sentences. And that's a very integrated operation. So I don't draw a boundary at the end of the sentence comprehension process. What I think is outside that automatized set of operations is performing tasks on the basis of what you've understood. And that's because comprehension is paired with so many different tasks. Comprehension is paired with putting things into long-term memory and semantic memory. It's paired with perceptual processes. It's paired with motor processes. It's paired with judgment processes. And so those pairings, I think, are nowhere near as practiced. They're much more heterogeneous. And I think that they probably are less automatized. I am using a lot of terms here that absolutely require both a theoretical and an empirical definition, but I don't know how else to characterize these processes. I mean, it's sort of hopefully bootstrapping and not drawing a circle.
I think it's a related question. You alluded to the fact that we may not get our measures right because of lack of correlation, but I'm just wondering whether we actually get the constructs right. And there's actually less discussion about that. And I was really interested in Marie's presentation that you talked about executive function, and you talk about executive attention, and some people talk about working attention. Some people talk about, or used to talk about, I can't remember now, but it was in the 70s in terms of the planning kind of thing. And people talk about inhibition and so on. And some other people talk about inhibition in relation to working memory. So I'm just wondering whether there should be, because there's a lot about measures, because obviously we can actually tangibly measure these, the values of these measures in terms of the reliability, especially, and the constant validity. But there is an issue with the constant validity, I think, as well as other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the as the first quarter or third or whatever of the talk on working memory must have indicated. I'm very sympathetic to the possibility that we are using a bunch of constructs that are that are not right. I really can't help you with the taxonomy of executive attention. I mean, I am very impressed with Akira Miyake's factor analysis, but I'm sure it's not the only factor analysis, and I'm sure that people disagree. But in the area of short-term memory, the central store, the central executive phonological store, there is enormous controversy about all of these measures. So, I mean, we might be wrong. And one of the things that I think is really important for the researchers here to be doing is to be thinking about measuring some other kinds of constructs. So, for instance, I don't know any papers that measure the capacity of the central store the way, say, Verhagen has or Cowan has, and try to correlate the capacity of that central store with these measures of online sentence comprehension, the way we have done with measures of, quote, working memory. If you were to ask McElroy, he would tell you that would be a pointless exercise, because he would say there's no such thing as a central store, all there is a focus of attention. And I'm not sure where he thinks individual differences lie. But if, you would have to ask him, since people do vary in their memory capacities, what should we be measuring that captures that variation? It might be the speed of the content addressable search in long-term memory. It might be the asymptote, I don't know what. Whatever he would say, I think, is something that if you want to take that model seriously as a model of a capacity that is, or a function that could be relevant to the memory requirements of sentence comprehension or discourse comprehension or anything else, then you have to measure it and see how it correlates. I'm not in a position, I know what I kind of think is most likely to be right at the moment, but I don't work in this. But I don't work in this field. And as far as I can tell, the pendulum about some of these things swings back and forth from year to year, and even talk to talk at psychonomics. I mean, last psychonomics that I heard about the issue of decay in short-term memory, Baroulet got up and convinced everybody that it was decay, and then Lewandowski got up and convinced everybody there wasn't. Then Baroulet asked a question, everybody thought there was, and I think the jury's out about some of these things. I do think it's really important to try to clarify some of these concepts. I think it's easier, not easy, but easier at the early end. I'm sorry, please. I think it's easier at the early end than when you get to more abstract things like executive attention, but hard enough even at the simpler concepts. I'm sorry, if there's time.
A quick question, or do you want to?
Well, it was a very maybe picayune thing about the measurement. I was a little concerned that many of your measures involved reading, but you were drawing conclusions about discourse comprehension. And when you gave examples of reading the sentences, it was much easier to comprehend them because of the stress, intonation, etc., that isn't present in reading. And a second point, again, perhaps picayune, was that the one study you did show when there was reaction time that you found an effect, a difference, that wasn't seen in your self-paced task. And that gave me pause, because most of the stuff you talked about was with the self-paced task, and perhaps that's not a sufficiently sensitive measure.
These are not picayune points. They're fundamental methodological and methods points. I think that's absolutely right. For purely practical reasons, experimental psycholinguistics has worked with written stimuli. And if you're going to work with written stimuli, I think that eye fixations are a better measure than self-paced reading. There's no question about that. We have started to do eye fixation studies, but we've been slow to get into that. There are 4 or 5 eye fixation studies, maybe as many as a dozen, looking at relationships between working memory measures and eye fixations on sentences that have various types of syntactic structures. Sue Kemper's done some of that. What's her name? Elizabeth Stein-Morrow and her colleagues and students have done some of that work. I'm going to sound, I don't know, I'm just going to sound the way I always sound. I think you have to read those papers really carefully. The claims in those papers don't always correspond to my reading of the data. If you are really interested in the eye fixation data, and I can give you a list, and I can give you my little blurb. I think that self-paced anything involves executive decisions about asking for the next word, but eye fixations involve some kind of decisions about when to move the eyes. There's a technique that's been used much more widely in the last 10 years with auditory sentence presentation and looking at pictures. This is the visual world paradigm. Again, doesn't get rid of executive control of eye fixation. People still have to decide whether they'll move their eyes. That's less automatized than reading, right? And I think all these studies do need to be done again with those kinds of dependent measures. Having said that, Ferrara and Henderson showed many years ago that non-cumulative self-paced reading simulates eye fixation data pretty well, and eye fixation data are probably a lot like what you do. I mean, well, there's obviously potential differences between the operations of the comprehension system for written and spoken language, which do absolutely need to be explored. One last point is that spoken language comprehension is, if anything, more automatized than written sentence comprehension. So whatever I said is likely to be true for the non-relationship of working memory to written sentence comprehension, it would logically follow that it's going to also be true for auditory sentence comprehension, although we don't know that.